I was here last year. Very lucky to be here and lucky to be back again this year. What a year it's been for us at Hydro One. Last year, when I was here, we were this close to go live and then extended and extended. Our go live finally went in 2023. So I'm here today to tell you just a little bit about how that go live went and how we're doing now. I'm not going to go into a lot of the technical details because it was a very big and complex implementation. But I know I've touched base with a couple of people today, a couple of different groups, and I'm more than happy to, either hop on a call if we can find some time here over the next couple of days. We can sit and have a chat. And I know there's a lot of opportunity for our utility to kind of sync up with what your utility is doing, regardless of what stage of your implementation you're at or what you're looking to do. So let's get rolling. So a couple things to cover today. The planning to production. I just want to go over some kind of key points on what we actually went through. So our background, just a little bit about Hydro One. We are Ontario's only distribution company from a rural perspective. I shouldn't say only, there are others, but we are the largest in Ontario. Some statistics, roughly 1.4 million customers, predominantly rural, and 26% of those total customers in Ontario, all of Ontario. So we do have some challenging geography, but we like to think that it makes us stronger by doing that. The DOT project itself, so as Pat mentioned, we kicked off our discovery phase, so actually, harvesting all of our business requirements, really putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard as it happened, because the pandemic came along and everyone was remote. So we started that in April 2020, and our implementation phase actually began in October 2020. So that's when things really got real. SBS, primary vendor for the design tool, and we did have another primary vendor for our costing and SAP-based implementation. Of course, we had the challenge with the pandemic. Who didn't? I think that's old news now at this point. The remote work and remote meetings and not being face-to-face, and of course, we were all struggling to figure all of that out. But, like everyone else, we made it work. So you can well imagine we had some challenges, but finally took our path to production May 2023 of this year. So it's still very recent and very real for me. So if I seem a little shell shocked, that's probably why. I'm still just getting over the shakes from it. What's changed? Just a quick little slide. This is actually lifted right from my presentation from last year, but just to give you an idea of the scope of what we decided to bite off. So we didn't just change the design tool and say out with the old design tool, in with the new. We changed the design tool. We changed hardware. We changed our mobile data collection. Didn't exist before. We changed, integrations, new Vault implementation, SAP IQ for analysis and data lake metrics gathering, Tableau for dashboards and reporting. So it was a big and complex project, and we bit it off and we made it work. So I'm very proud of what the entire team did. I could probably stand here for the next 30 minutes and list off all of the team members that participated in this project. But for anybody that's listening, and just know that I owe my gratitude to all of them as well for making this happen. So a little bit about the implementation details itself. Just wanted to cover off a few things. Because we do interface with SAP, currently it's ECC on the front end. We do use UDH EAM, and that's our main interface for bringing data in and out of SAP. So it's a bidirectional interface for us. The SAP work order and notification details do come in and out of AUD through UDH EAM. And so that's everything from work order notification details, customer details, our asset information, right down to pole identification, pole treatment types, that sort of thing. So we harvest all of that usable data from SAP, use that in our design process, and then we've built it so that it can be pushed back. But just a quick, glance at what a work order browser window looks like in EAM. You can see this would be what a designer would see, a list of all work orders in a variety of statuses, and they're ready to go and get access to them. So the big thing for us was the ability to have that bidirectional. So in these work order properties, like I say, I almost feel like I don't do it justice because it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we've actually built. But this is just one example, we are able to make edits to the SAP data in terms of technical master data. So things like the concession, the heating source, is it a customer owned transformer? These are all values that are important to us during design process, during regulatory reviews. They all have a factor on how we do our design, so they're all important. Service location, our latitude, longitude, station feeder, all this sort of thing. So we harvest all this information kind of up front in that EAM side, and then it goes to a variety of different places. In a lot of cases, right back to SAP to get stored. Other cases, it's used in the design process. It may show up on the face of the layout, the actual construct print, so it can go all over. The one really slick thing that about EAM, when we first kind of got wind of AUD, we knew that it could do a lot of validation rules and it could do a lot of amazing things. In fact, Pat said it could take us to the moon if we wanted, and we wanted to, but we never did work on it. We'll get there. But some of the validation rules that you can do in EAM. So a lot of systems, we found SAP was very finicky. If you put bad data back into SAP, it's going to choke. So guess what? AUD can do, with some fairly simple configuration, can do some validation. It can validate that data before it pushes it back into SAP to prevent your ERP system from just blowing up, right? So it was great. One of the big things that we wanted to have, switch and transformer. Sounds pretty basic and pretty elementary, but we found that users were consistently either forgetting to put that information right at the meter point, or they just weren't doing it, whatever the case. But we can write a hard-coded rule directly in EAM to say, no, I'm just not going to push it out. So we could have actually written that rule in AUD, like in config as well, and it could go there. But there's ways around it. You can set things to never auto-resolve. You can deactivate rules in config. This one, the user cannot get around this one. So that's a hard stop. So, little features like that make it very flexible and just make it a very, almost infinitely configurable tool. On the back end, we use UDHGIS for our GIS input and output as well. So all of our electrical infrastructure is been configured into WS maps, web map services, for those who are familiar with it, to visualize our DX assets. So we're primarily distribution, or at least my side is distribution. So this is all of our feeders, overhead, underground, all the protective devices with switches, right down to transformers, right down to secondary lines, and even meters. So all that information is very valuable in the design process. This UDHGIS allows us to visualize those assets using just a cut of a web map service. And then there's a process where our designers can actually import. So they'll open up a connection with FDGIS and import the data, and it gets converted, cleaned up, and it gets built into actual AUD features that we're then able to manipulate. We're able to run rules against, we're able to connect to, map to, model, all that sort of thing. So very, very flexible, and allows us to do some pretty nifty things. The WMS services are really just bound by your imagination and how much data you have. So one thing we wanted to do was just to visualize, we call them foreign utilities. So there's a high pressure gas main in the area. Obviously, that's going to have some impact on one designer's decision to put a pole in the ground. They can turn that layer on and visualize that. You can take it one step further, and you could actually have that layer import as a feature, which you can then write rules against. So you could actually have it import as an AUD feature and then say, designer has placed a pole inside this polygon. That's a hard stop because we just don't put poles on top of gas mains. UDHGIS, yeah, it's configured to import data from the FDGIS and convert it to the features. On the back end then of that process, we actually export the data as well back to our design container, which is affectionately known as a design hosted feature layer, which is, you can only say that 3 or 4 times in a row before you start looking for easier ways to say it. Design container is kind of what we landed on. It's sort of an intermediary. Think of the hub in the center of a wagon wheel and all the things come towards it. It's the hub where all that data is stored in our entire design, construct, build workflow. And then other systems kind of pull from that. So the designer exports the data, and mobile construct tools can pull data from that. GIS, ultimately, the playback layer lives there in the design container. So the GIS technicians, when they go to play that information back, can take it from there. Yeah, we've got a lot of options for it. So it's sort of a newer concept for us, for sure, but we built it out, proved it worthwhile, and it's working. I don't want to say perfectly, nothing ever works perfectly, but it's working relatively well. And as far as AUD config, that's sort of where I live. It's where, through the implementation process, I got involved with all three streams, through both sides of UDH and through the AUD config. Since the project wound down, I focused more on the AUD config side, but I do still get looped into lots of the other sides just because of my involvement all through the project. But we built dozens and dozens of model and lookup tables. I think, Jeremy showed some tables earlier today, which gives you an idea of the type of tables. Just multiply that by dozens, if not hundreds. So when we did our implementation, we ended up with, a large number. Big process, but very worthwhile. After those tables were built, after we had all of our models set up, we had rules to write. So that was part of the process that I think we talked about earlier. How do you address that? It goes back to that discovery phase. What is the most important rule? What do you need your tool to do? And what's the priority level on that, right? So we have hundreds of rules that we use to do everything from auto-generate or auto-set a phasing, if it's a red phase or a white phase or that sort of thing on a conductor, right to building an entire pole line, right? That's all the type of rules that you can build and you can configure and make work for you. The one big thing that we did do is put all of our engineering standards into the AUD tool. And it was a big topic of conversation at last year's PUG. In hindsight, it's still a very valid thing to do, but our issue was the manual effort required to do it. So we understood it would be a manual effort to get all of those tables. Our engineering group, I should backtrack a second. Our engineering group produces 150 to 200 page manuals with tables, with what's the word? Not slush factors, but resiliency factors sort of thing in there, so that designers can class poles, they can determine sag, they can do all the things that a distribution designer would normally do, table-based. So we don't use SpiderCalc, we don't use OCalc, we don't use, as a distribution designer, we don't use any of those external programs, we just use the policies that are laid out by those engineering standards. So what we did is we took those 400 pages with however many tables and built those into AUD. It was a very manual process, and we understood that it was going to be. The maintenance of that is something that you need to understand. So you can do that, but understand the maintenance of it, because what we're finding is that, and Jeremy, you mentioned it this morning, it's an effort to do that. You have to plan for it. You have to base that maintenance activity and how to make that happen, how to roll that out to the users, how to train that to the end users, right? Those are big things. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself because that's more of my lessons learned, but it's a very important thing. And it was just very relevant that it came up this morning because it's something that's been fresh in my mind for a while. The other thing I wanted to mention too, just in our config, we have a complex contestability engine, and I would be more than happy to show it off to anybody who wants to see it. Probably not on the screen, it's not going to display very well, but if anybody wants to see it, let me know, and I'm more than happy to show it off. It was a monumental effort, but it handles some of our very complicated and very obtuse costing rules that we don't do costing in AUD, but we do set some cost elements or some cost factors that we can pass through our bill of materials over to SAP. So AUD doesn't do the costing itself. It doesn't really care about dollars and cents, but it might say, well, this pole is wood versus steel. This pole is set in solid rock, whereas this pole is set in soil. Different types of work, different types of cost factors, right? So we'll pass those over to SAP in the bill of materials. And then even right down to the who pays. Is it the customer that's paying for that, or is the company paying for it from an investment system investment perspective? Is there an alternative bid option? All these types of kind of complex factors. We call them contestability in Hydro One. I've talked to a lot of others that call it different things, but we built a very complex contestability engine that will largely automate that process. I don't want to say perfectly. We're still fine tuning it, but it is very impressive. So it takes a lot of factors from SAP, work type, is it a new customer connection? Is it a line extension? Is it a project rebuild? Is it a maintenance job? It takes all those types of factors, cycles through even more tables to figure out what scenario or what situation it is. And then it applies the cost factors right down to the individual model level. So in a given setup, I could have a transformer. Those drop leads off the overhead transformer might be chargeable to the customer, but the transformer itself, the company's going to pay for. And then the secondary conductor riser might be optional for eligible bid, like that complex. And that's what we deal with, which is fine. That's what we're legally obliged to do, and we'll handle it. And luckily, we have a tool that is configurable and adaptable enough to help us do that in a consistent approach. That's the big thing, because our tool before we could do that, it was all manual, and anybody just did whatever they wanted. It was up to their interpretation. We don't have nearly 1,600 users or 1,500. We're 300 to 400, given on the time of year, but still enough. And it's still a management difficulty to keep everybody consistent. So
that contestability was actually a prime example of why we do our semi-agile process, because they had this spreadsheet after spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and someone said, "Hey, Sarah, I don't think you can do this," which was the wrong thing to say, because Sarah then said, "Yes, I can." But we went through that process, and as we went through it, Hydro One was finding all kinds of stuff like, why are we doing that? And it didn't bring the project to a stop. We would just say, okay, let's just go to the next one, and then we would go down, and then they would say, oh, yeah, we have to do that, or no, we don't need to do that. Or we would implement it, and they would say, that's not the result we expected, go back again. Because it was a very, very complex thing, and the rules on it were very obtuse at best, and they couldn't get consistency. So we were able to just go through, and it was like they were major things that they were doing for years that they were like, let's just call the governing body, whoever it was, and say, do we really have to do this? And they would say no, and we could just take it right out the next day. So it was really a prime example of how the semi-agile process works.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into what I've got a slide on a little later in the presentation too, just around proper planning. But we'll get to that for sure. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about successes. So some of the things that we've done and just made happen. So our cutover weekend, I think we were all dreading it. We had some extended testing cycles, sit 1, 2, 4, 7, 9. We went through several sit cycles, and UAT got extended. We had multiple testing cycles that I'd never even heard of. That's fine. Testing's good. Testing's really good. But it still felt, after 3 years, it still felt as though we weren't ready for go live, even though all of us just wanted it to be done, I think. So go live happened, I think it was May 18th. We have it's Memorial Day weekend in Canada. We went over that weekend, and it went remarkably well, eerily well, to the point where a lot of us were sitting there, not twiddling our thumbs. There was always something to do, but we were waiting for the sky to fall, and it didn't, which was great. And I think it spoke volumes to the people that were involved, just the sheer amount of testing that we did, the amount of planning. So, I don't want to take credit for it. I was just one of many people that did it, but it went remarkably well. We did have some bigger issues. They were more on the SAP side, not going to throw them under the bus. They got a lot of complex things to do as well. But on our side, on the AUD side, it was a pleasure and remarkably smooth. That's maybe hard to see. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. But this was, week 1, and it was a slow build. We started pulling some metrics. We started pulling some numbers to gauge uptake. How quickly were users getting on board? How quickly was the system churning through what we were expecting? And this one was as of June 2nd. So we've been live just over a week. Not stunning numbers. We'd had 20 designs approved. We'd had 125 designs make it all the way through the design process up to the stage where they were submitted for a supervisor for review and approval. 562 linked designs. So to me, that was a big one. The link process is where the designer receives it in their workflow program, says, I'm ready to start the design. They link it, merges up all the SAP information, and they move on. But they've started the design process by the time they get to link. So 562. And I'm looking at this after week one and thinking, this is pretty good. Like, this is actually all right. And then, we see some other numbers, 583 actually in design status. That's the internal status that we have. 4235, that's sort of an irrelevant number for this particular one. That's work orders that were ready to go, that our field business center had prepped in SAP. They were sort of stacked in the hopper, ready to go. But it meant that our system was robust enough that we were able to kind of handle that pressure and handle the incoming volume. And even a week in, given a few setbacks early in the game, ADETs, that's what we call our designers. I'm supporting are doing a remarkable job of familiarizing themselves with AUD while utilizing the tools and training resources provided to them to the best of their ability. So, not every user was that happy. There were lots that were frustrated. There were lots that were having difficulties and having a hard time letting go of the old system and coming on board with the new. But by and large, we had that kind of response with our designers, which was great. It was really good. So flash forward 12 weeks of hypercare, and the numbers continued to pump up. So, by July 27th, we had 2,411 designs had gone all the way through, right to the approval process. And we were sitting with 548 currently waiting for approval. In design, 1,267 that were actively being worked on, and that could be for any reason. It could be they just started that day, could be they made it all the way through. Maybe they're waiting for some municipality to give some approvals. Could be the system broke and they're waiting on me to help them to fix it. It could be a lot of things, right? But the numbers kept ticking upwards and trending upwards, which was a good sign for us. And it meant that, we had done something right. And we didn't have all, like I said, perfectly rosy feedback, The one end user from Design Services tool has been great outside of the obvious learning curves for everyone. The power users, which were our support network inside the company, they've been great in providing answers when they can, and if they can't, they went above and beyond in finding answers for it. So sort of leads me into some of the other things that I want to talk about. We talk about the technology and the part that I was very much involved in, which I'm happy to share with everybody. But there was other parts of the project that I wasn't directly involved in, which was things like training, which was things like setting up the power user network, rolling out the change management process, which are absolutely huge. And from where I'm standing today, 3 months into a production cutover and go live, I really appreciate how important those things are for a company, regardless of how many users you have, regardless of how big your implementation is. You might only have 3 designers, or you might have 3,000, but keeping that sort of planning in mind, that change management, training especially, and then not just that 5-day crash course drinking from a fire hose. There's got to be some sweep behind. There's got to be that acknowledgement that we're all human and we're not going to be able to retain, a 5-week or 5-day crash course in something as complex as a brand new design tool, right? The other big success that we had that I'm involved in personally is the sustainment plan. It did take over a year to develop, but we were doing the talks and the discussions in conjunction with everything else. Everything happened all at the same time. So we took our time and really hammered out a sustainment plan. Currently, the sustainment team spans across 2 different work groups. So there's one that's more focused on IT specific, so hardware related, servers, database access, things like that. And then there's the group that I'm part of, which is more on the business side, supporting end users and supporting things like AUD configuration, with more of an eye to business rules. They do contain both project resources and new. And so from that perspective, containing a project resource, there's no way that that's not a good thing unless they're completely ruined, right? If someone spent 2 years or 3 years on a project and have gained all that really great information, they're going to be almost invaluable to you by the time that project's done in supporting it if that's the model you choose. I know some people choose not to support in-house. They want to leverage a support contract and have it completely supported external. And if that's the case, I'd still recommend keeping some of your project resources close by internal, because they're going to have all of that incredibly valuable knowledge that you're going to rely on a regular basis. For us, the path to production spans three different environments. So we have a project dev environment where we develop our fixes. We have sustainment QA environments where we do our QA QC, sort of a staging environment, ultimately getting through the production. So for us, we're a heavily regulated company. We want to make sure that we are not inadvertently introducing any sort of errors that may impact billing, design, and certainly safety, right? So we test, test, test. All of our changes get through. It does slow down the overall path to production process, but it is worthwhile in that it eliminates the chances of us missing something. We've already caught it a couple of times where we didn't catch something the first time. We go through our rigorous testing process, and sure enough, okay, back to the drawing board, but it didn't get to production, right? So that's a good thing. Because we had a lot of cost testing, costing was paramount to us, even more so than, is a work location call out showing up on the layout. That's important to me, but if a customer gets a bill for $500,000 when they should have got it for $5,000, that's a bigger deal, because that's going to really get some attention. So cost testing took priority. There was significant testing done on the design portion, on the AUD and the systems testing, but we didn't have the full amount as much as we wanted. So we knew there was going to be a high number of, I'll call them defects, right? They're not necessarily defects, they're issues. In some cases, there were legitimate defects. Things were broken, they just weren't working, and we could work to fix them. That's not a problem. We planned for it. But our sustainment group was able to diagnose, triage, and develop fixes for over 50 defects in amongst that UDH side and the config side during our sustainment or our hypercare, which was after May 2023 till just up to a couple of weeks ago. So I think that's pretty good in conjunction with handling all the user issues, the questions, the meetings, just handling that general chaos that is the tail end of a 3-year project as it exits, and trying to handle all that. So most of them were able to be fixed in-house. We've set up a contract with a trusted partner, but SPS is still very much involved. So when we get really deep into the weeds, if it's something that we're not familiar with, and when I say we, it's myself, Andre Paquette, he couldn't be here today, but we get right into the weeds with some of the more complicated rules that we've written. And if we're not able to get them, it's a reach out to either our partner network or to SPS, and we're able to get these things resolved fast and also get them pushed through. So we plan to develop and execute 2 bundles and 2 releases in that 12-week period. So there were a total of 4 updates sent out to the or to the AUD program that were planned in that sustainment, pardon me, the hypercare period. So in our term, a bundle is a config only, so that's just a template. So those of you who are familiar with it, a template is things like your models, it's things like your rules, it's things like the style, the look, the feel of how the program operates. On the UDH side, that's more of how is it sending data to the GIS, or how is it sending information to SAP, or validating that information, right? So a bundle for us is a template update, and we were able to push 2 of those completely unassisted. And then 2 releases, which we actually had to come back to SPS and request a build, right? So we had to say, can you build us a new installer package? We had to run it through all of our QA QC, building all these installers to distribute to our users. Quite a lengthy process, but just a success as far as I'm concerned. I did not expect, I suppose, I did, part of me did, but I didn't expect to be able to execute that as quickly as we did and turn it around as effectively as we did. The successes, the training and support side. So, we have a dedicated team, or we had a dedicated team throughout the life of the project that were developed specifically to developing training content. And they did an absolutely fantastic job. It's a shame that they couldn't be here, but Ed White, he led the charge over on that side. And, he did an amazing job. The entire team did. They took it, they understood it, they adapted to the, changing policies I'm sure they used to get frustrated with us on the config side because we'd tweak a rule or we'd make a slight change or change the way a block looked or worked, and then they'd have to catch up with it. But they did a great job. So, my recommendation for anybody who's in this sort of stage is have that training network in place, right, in house, because they do double duty. If you can make that happen, they do double duty. They're learning the tool and they're learning it inside and out, like, detail. Then they're putting together quality product. And who's got a better stake in developing training content than the person who has to turn around then and deliver it to their colleagues or their peers, and who's also going to be responsible for hopefully maintaining it down the road. So I think that's a great way to approach it. Our training content is housed on a searchable site. It's SAP, not nearly as good as the previous presentation that we just saw, but it works. So it's searchable, kind of like a little Google engine. Users can go back to refer to it if they need a quick refresh. Training developers can refer people back to it. They could build a course on it, or whatever the case. So, a great resource for us. And then the training and support, the Power User Network, was something that we developed inside the business. It was pulled from, the design services group, and they lived through the life cycle of the project. They got in on training. In a lot of cases, they were part of the training development team, transferred into the power user role, and they existed during that hypercare rollout process. So they were the go-to, right? They were the boots on the ground, people that were the first line of defense when the end user threw up their hands on the first day, said, I don't know what this is garbage. Power user, what do you tell me? And the power user could hopefully talk them off the ledge. And in most cases they did. But, you build up that power user network. So power user, who do they escalate to? Super power user, you frame it up how you want. Superpower user, ultimately up. What we want to avoid is someone like myself, getting phone calls, emails, messages from 300 users that don't necessarily know what they're doing. And I don't mean that to sound bad, but it's day one of a brand new program. And as good as the training is, not everyone's going to understand it perfectly on day one. So you don't want those people coming all the way back. You want that network of power users there that's going to be able to help weed out the usability issues or the user issues, right? What I want to see coming across my inbox is the technical problems. The system should be doing this. When I drop a transformer, it should do this. Instead, it's not. It's doing this. And that's a technical problem. I'll fix that, right? But I don't want to see, I can't figure out how to drop a work order polygon. That's not a technical problem. That's a you problem, right? So that's where building that kind of sustainment process, the power user network, really just understanding your change management network, that's where it really comes in well. And the other big success too is just the ability to make changes. And I think it was one of the big reasons we as a company went with the AUD product, because it's configurable, because it has the option to be managed in-house. And I was very fortunate to be part of that process. We've had the ability to learn some very complex rules, and I realize you probably won't get a chance to see that. I won't have time necessarily to go through, but again, I invite anybody who's interested, come find me at some point. More than happy to show you this. But total KVA, it's hilarious, Jeremy, that you guys put that up today, but it's very similar to where you guys were at with that. How do you calculate total KVA on a secondary network, right? So this was an interesting one because Sarah had actually configured the rule primarily for us way back, probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, but we found an issue with it. And we really didn't find it till just the tail end of our UAT. And Andre and I wanted to take a stab at fixing it. We didn't want to just pass it back and say, something's not working, can you fix it for us? We wanted to take a stab at it. And we found that our knowledge had grown to the point, just sort of organically, grown to the point where we could get into this complex rule, break it down, understand all of its parts, and then find where the problem was. And we did. So, I think it says something that, I'm not a coder, I'm not a programmer. I didn't take anything like computer engineering, anything like that. My background was a field designer. I was an ADET. I was a customer service rep originally when I started with the company. So I would go to the customers' houses and, make them happy. So I didn't have that background, but it is easy enough. I don't call it easy. It's not easy, but it is accessible enough to be able to learn that if that's what your organization wants to do, is to bring that in-house. So I just got to give, credit where credit's due on that. A couple of other ones, pole classing. I mentioned the fact that our engineering group produces standards with tables and values. The pole classing gets pretty gnarly. Again, we've I want to say we, this one was Andre primarily, almost Andre, but Andre was able to zero in on what was going on. There were some issues. It ended up being a reverse order of the way that we were running through a list or running through a dictionary. We were doing it the opposite direction, and it was always returning the highest class pool, which we didn't want. So again, it's accessible, right? You're able to get in there, actually understand, and make things. And this one I might actually say for tomorrow. I think I'm back up to do a little afternoon lesson or learning sort of thing. I might save this and just dive into this mid-span tap rule. We just uncovered this one a couple of weeks ago, and I learned a lot about vectors, 3D vectors, and points that I had never even thought I would get myself into. But I love sharing that kind of thing with like-minded folks, so we may get into that a little tomorrow. So lessons learned. This is the best way to describe it. No matter what your plan is, it's going to look something like that. That's the reality, right? Our plan was great. We had it all mapped out. Everything was rosy. I wish I had had a sunshine in there. The reality was it probably looked twice as bad as that by the time we were said and done. But, plan for the worst. Take time to understand the scale and the complexity of the project. And I cannot repeat that enough. Even when you think you've got it, stop, reevaluate, and think again, and think of all the contingencies and all the possibilities. It's really important that you understand that up front. The semi-agile approach works. We're proof of that. You can make that happen. But by, taking that time and understanding all of the issues up front, you're going to save yourself a lot of frustration in the end. And then you can reserve the semi-agile approach for the few things that do pop up instead of the hundreds that will pop up if you haven't got your whole process down. Take time to develop a plan that's realistic and flexible. We kind of got caught because we started this whole thing as COVID came along. It's a pandemic. We didn't know what realistic was or what was even achievable. So we kind of got caught on that. Our timelines got crunched and a little compressed. We've made it work. But, given that hopefully there's not another big major worldwide event like that in the next few years, but just be realistic. Develop a plan that's realistic, but don't forget to build in that flexibility, right? Be flexible, be ready to adapt. That adaptability is huge. You've got a project plan, follow it, but be ready to modify it. If some big immovable stone comes along, you can't just walk around it. You got to fix it, right? So be ready to adapt. And one of the big things, don't underestimate the power of end user engagement and plan accordingly. So when I say that, this is recent in my mind because we're only a few weeks out of our hypercare program. And, I'm talking to the end users in the field and getting their feedback, the good, the bad, medium. And the way that we rolled out that end user engagement, our training, the way that we communicated with them, we provided them regular updates, we provided them access to training. Not perfect, but it worked. It got them energized. It got them excited. And I'm talking about, these are people who are just using it every day. So it got them involved. Don't underestimate that change management side of things. It's huge. It's huge. Spend time and resources on that. And kind of tying into that, communication, that's key. Make sure that you're communicating effectively. I think IT projects have the tendency to kind of get done in silos. A lot of times you forget, you get busy, you get wrapped up with emergencies, you're trying to put fires out. But communication to everybody involved is key. If you're working on multiple streams, you've got a project the size of the one that we embarked on, you got to make sure that all of those streams are talking and are communicating. Do you have a question at the back? If Pat, you want to grab them? Yeah, plan for those communications and be ready to communicate to all of those team resources so that you're not doing things over again when you learned that the other stream did something that you didn't agree to, and then you've got to rebuild it. And anyway, it's a pain. But yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, on your go live implementation, what system did you have? Your legacy system? When you moved to AUD, and was it a true conversion where you're converting in-flight design data over to the new solution, or was it a migration where you're letting it kind of life cycle out and
Yeah.
initiating new?
So no, that's a great question. Did we convert? Was there migration? We'd originally planned on migrating the data. Our old system was Arc Designer. We'd planned on migrating the data as much as we could. The reality was that was a tall order. We just weren't able to salvage a lot of those in-flight designs. So if there were designs that a designer was actively working on that hadn't been sent for approval, the messaging that went out ahead of time, there was a 2 or 3 week freeze, I think, before cutover that said, just don't start any new activity. You've got 2 weeks to finish it up because as of this date, the old system is turned off, the new system is turned on. So the in-flight, or the in process ones were not convertible. Anything where the design itself had been completed and it was just waiting for maybe customer acceptance or customer payment or materials to be ordered, that all existed in the SAP system anyway, or there were scripts written to convert it into SAP, and they were able to migrate a number of designs, not nearly as many as we wanted though.
So today you're running in parallel with some of that in-flight work?
Not even parallel, I would say. So there are designs. So the design itself is not parallel. There are no parallel designs. If there were something that needed to be recreated from the old system, it was just that. It was recreated, right? So you can take a copy of the PDF or whatever the output was from the old system and redraw it in AUD. And it's made quicker. It was a good opportunity for users to learn. We kind of tried to spin it that way, but a way to introduce it into the system. So the only thing that was migrated or that was sort of in parallel are jobs that were done and submitted and, like I said, pending customer approval. That bill of material was already in SAP and it continues to live in SAP in perpetuity. So on the AUD side, there's really no impact. We don't even really know about them. If there was a change, let's say that there was a field change when it came time to construct, that's where things get a little interesting. We handle those more on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the scale of the change, right? Our work practices are to feed back those changes into GIS. FDGIS is where we capture all that as-built information. So rather than, if it's a bigger design, rather than go through the effort of recreating the design in AUD only just to change one pole head from a heavy corner to a medium corner or from a cross arm to a improved appearance or whatever, we would probably just have the GIS tech do that manually, right? Instead of doing design, but
So
sort of handled on
what-
a case by case.
What made them unique was SAP did not do costing in the old system. That was all done in a custom solution called Moneybags on Schneider. So when they went to the new system, now we were not sending costs to SAP anymore. We were saying, hey, this pole was going into rocky soil and it's being owned by this. And so SAP wouldn't understand that data if you were trying to run. So the only option was to have two SAP solutions, and we barely had one. So it wasn't an option. So we were, like Brian said, if it had already been submitted to SAP, we could update it, or they could continue the processing. But if it was a new design, we were able to bring the graphics into AUD and then write the rules to assign as many variables as we could, but then there was a manual cleanup. But that's because it was basically a whole new utility is what we did. Adam?
Just a couple of nuances there. We did migrate SAP work orders that were in flight, so those did get migrated so we could use later. We also leveraged contractors for any large work that was in flight, specifically subdivisions that because the life cycle of them is so long, they would be so labor intensive to redraw. We leverage contractors to redraw those ones. And then just one other nuance to your question, our in-flight designs that we couldn't migrate, we're still dealing with them from a construction standpoint. So they still flow through our system. A construction crew might still get an old design as well as a new one on the same day.
So on your complex costing, do you have the ability with an AUD? So let's just say, here's an example. So you have a switch that needs to go in. Customer only needs a manual switch. Engineering wants a SCADA switch. Engineering's got their own budget. We have the new business budgets to take care of the customer. Do you have a way to let that SCADA switch go in, charge the engineering budget with the differential between what a manual switch would be and the SCADA switch,
Yep.
and push it into SAP?
Yeah. So we do that with transformers, with pad mount. Typically, by design, we would try to always install an overhead transformer where possible. It's cheaper, it's more accessible, right? There are cases where a customer will elect to have a pad-mounted transformer, aesthetics, whatever the case. So we'll charge them an incremental. So the way we did it was in the model table, we have the equivalent CU in the underground model table, so we've got a 25 kVA pad-mounted transformer, we would have the equivalent CU of that overhead. And then those two things get passed to SAP for our situation, and SAP takes care of that costing. We do set an attribute on the transformer that says there's a differential applied here. That's SAP's way of knowing that it has to do some more complex calculation. But basically, with a combination of attributes and just that raw data, we're able to give SAP what it needs to do that sort of differential.
So you'll put that differential to a different budget?
In SAP, it's costed. Yeah, exactly. It's costed different. So in our case, it would be, the customer would only pay the differential. So if a overhead transformer is $5,000, the pad mounted equivalent is $7,500. Customer's only paying $2,500. It does that math and covers the differential.
And you do that with attributes.
With attributes, a combination of attributes that are user definable, like the actual designer might toggle it a Boolean yes, no, and model attributes that are stacked.
Yeah, currently our process is a little more complicated than that. We use, in SAP, we won't have it set up in AUD yet, but we will do negative quantities. So we'll put a SCADA switch going in on this budget, have the switch that's actually we want to bill for going, subtracting that cost out of the engineering budget, and it's very complex.
Yeah. So, and I mean, what you could also do is use multiple work orders, right? We kind of touched on that earlier today, multiple designs in one work order, but I mean, AUD has the ability to do multiple work orders. So if you wanted to say work order A is for, customer facing, that's what we want to bill the customer, but work order B is what you want to pass back to as investment or, part of the, and you could have those two work orders linked, active in that design, and the designer just says, the bulk of the work, what's going to the customer, this work order, what's going to, asset management, this work order. So there's multiple ways of doing it. It's kind of just depends on how far, but this is the interesting part that I found. It's good to understand how many different ways there are, because if you jump on the first one, it might not be the most effective for your users, right? So you want a combination of having your user experience be good, but you also want the ultimate goal of getting what you want, right? So you have to kind of understand, would it be better to have them set two work orders or to have your admin staff prep, new columns with new CUs? That's a maintenance item. They have to have the equivalent CU. You have to have somebody develop a new attribute on the model itself with that toggle. So there's things, there's valid points to both ways of doing it, and there's probably a third or a fourth if we were to sit and talk about it long enough. But take your time. Don't just jump at the first one just because it's the first one that you come up with. Have a little brainstorm session, you know what I mean, and come up with those ideas. That's sort of what we've taken to do through that life cycle of the project. We would just grab the first thing. We'd have a problem came up, and the solution would kind of appear to us out of a haze. We jump on it. But now in hindsight, we're like, I wish we had done it a little bit different. So it goes on a map, and we'll circle back to it at some point. Lesson learned, right? But yeah.
I think the other lesson learned for that scenario was, and we had this fight more than one time, it would be, hey, you guys got to give us all this information in AUD and tell us what the cost difference is between the two. And you'd have to push back, saying, why are you putting your costing system, which is an SAP function, into my design tool? That's why they were stuck on a system for over 10 years, the money bags, because now you got customization. So when we got in the argument with the SAP people, it's like, no, we don't do costing. I'll give you the information for you to do costing, but your job is costing. So that's why we say, hey, I'll give you the CU that should have been here, and I'll give you the CU that is here. You cost it.
Our costing is outside of, we build our own costing engine, so it's not done in SAP either. So, but the thing is it's driven off the CUs that are in SAP. And right now there's only one direction as far as the CUs go. It goes from AUD to SAP. So we make a change, and then we later on have to do an FCO. Then we have to try to keep the systems in sync. So that's a complication for us. Yeah.
I understand that one. But I mean, this is where you have to look. You have to look at an enterprise solution. And there's a lot of arguments that will occur during this. I actually got some Canadians to swear one time. It was. So But you know, you can't think of I got to get through this implementation. It's I got to get through this implementation and maintain and upgrade and go forward on the system. The same problem we ran into at SCE, the old system that we replaced. They couldn't do upgrades. You know, they were paying a huge amounts to keep on Windows 7 because they couldn't upgrade. Now they do upgrades on a regular basis. You know, it's the same thing we run into every time you run into these customized solutions. It's hard and it's a fight. And there's ways, you know, to phase it in, but you really want to get to that phased in approach of SAP is costing, Maximo is costing, work order is work. You know, we always get asked, well, start managing my work orders. Why? You got a work management system. I will work interface with your work management system. So it is a hard fight, and that's kind of what our job is to help you get through those fights.
So one of my favorite Pat quotes was, just because your daddy did it that way and your daddy's daddy did it that way doesn't mean you have to do it that way. I didn't want to use that one again this year, but I found one and it's unknown, but I think it might be Pat Reed. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And I think that sums it up pretty accurately. Take the time that you have either at the start of an implementation, in the middle of, after the implementation, your first year of sustainment, whatever the case. But look for ways to not just drag your old system along, your old policies, your old way of doing things. Look for that opportunity to build something new. And I think you'll be far more successful that way, right? It's not always the easiest way. Sometimes it's easy to hit that. It's way easier to hit the easy button, just mash it and move on. But the reality is you'll have much better results if you take that time and effort to build something that's new instead of just limping it along.